Peter is a British journalist. He's an author, a broadcaster. He currently writes for the Mail on Sunday, which I mentioned, where he's a columnist. He's an occasional foreign correspondent, reporting most recently from Iran, North Korea, Burma, the Congo. Do we still call it Burma and the Congo? And China. A former revolutionary, he attributes his return to faith largely to his experience of socialism in practice, which he witnessed during his many years reporting in Eastern Europe, and his nearly 3 years as a resident correspondent in Moscow during the collapse of the Soviet Union. He lived and worked in the U.S. from 1993 to 95. He lives in Oxford with his wife Eve. They have 3 children. As usual at Socrates, we will hear from our speaker for a little bit, and then we will open things up for a robust Q&A to which we always look forward. So please give our speaker, Peter Hitchens, a warm Socrates in the City welcome.
Don't really need to say anything now, do I? It's all been done. Two small announcements. One, I am one of those rare British people who believes in the death penalty, and I believe in it particularly for people who leave their cell phones switched on during public meetings, and I am prepared to execute it myself. The other is that some time ago, in fact, the origin of this book is rooted in this event. Some time ago in Grand Rapids in Michigan, I took part ill-advisedly, perhaps as ill-advisedly as I'm here tonight, in a debate with my brother Christopher. And I realized as I walked into the auditorium, which was larger even than this, that there were 1,200 people there who wished I was dead. They'd come to hear him. I mentioned this to Eric, and he said, well, there's only 350 people here tonight who wish you're dead. Which is a comfort. I would like to begin with a small account of something which happened to me. It was one of the results of being a newspaper reporter, and also one of the results of pride, vanity, and attempting to cover my own back. I worked at the time for another newspaper, now so degenerated that I won't name it. And I was in Jerusalem doing something else quite peaceful, which involved wearing a suit and tie and interviewing politicians. And it was just before President George Bush, the one without the W, had intended to send the Marines into Somalia. And I thought, well, Israel's quite close to Somalia. And just to show willing, I would telephone my newspaper and say, would you like me to go to Somalia? In that tone of voice which you use when you're expecting the answer, no thanks. And they said, no thanks, and I was very relieved. But a few days later, I was sitting at lunch in Jerusalem, and they telephoned me again and said, we've changed our minds. We'd like you to go to Mogadishu. And so, there I was, in a blue suit and polished black shoes, sitting on top of a heap of cargo in a Soviet transport plane, coming into land at Mogadishu International Airport. I'll tell you one thing about it. Sitting on a heap of cargo when a Russian transport plane lands is quite fun because it all slides all the way down the plane as you're sitting on top of it. And I have never, ever since taken even remotely seriously those airline safety briefings that we all have to undergo. I know that if you slid down to the other end of the fuselage, nothing would happen to you. But when you get out of the plane at Mogadishu International Airport, and this, I have to tell you, was a long time ago, it's worse now, there is no passport control. There are no customs. There is absolutely nothing except a small group of 12 and 13-year-old boys with AK-47s. And what they say to you is, would you like a bodyguard? And you turn to the only person there who's actually the Associated Press man who's taking delivery of this cargo on which you've been sitting, and you say, do I need a bodyguard? And he says, yes, you'd better have a bodyguard. If you don't have a bodyguard, you'll be stripped and dead by morning. So there's then a little bit of what we journalists call international sign language involving dollar bills. And at the end of it, I and my colleague, a very fine photographer called John Downing, have hired 3 bodyguards, 3 AK-47s, and a car without any internal trim or upholstery whatsoever, in which we set out into Mogadishu to try to find somewhere to spend the night. And we very, very nearly fail. In the end, it's only because John sees a colleague of his who he knows from Sarajevo, who invites us into a compound which has been hired by a German television crew, who very, very grudgingly allow us to share their concrete floor and their camel stew. It is only because of them that we're able to say goodbye to the bodyguards till the following day and to spend the night in the compound listening to the chatter of submachine gun fire and the screams of the dying, who would have been us if we hadn't been in there. Following morning, the bodyguards return and they offer their services again. And we head off into the city and we see departing the gangs of terrorist murderers who are leaving because the US Marines are about to arrive. And we are then given a tour, with its very frightening moments, of the city of Mogadishu as it then was. The main street, entirely composed of mud and potholes. The buildings, every single one of them filled with bullet holes, or indeed shell holes, or demolished. The people, most of them armed, and armed in a way which does not suggest that they're going to restrain themselves if anything goes wrong. One of our bodyguards was also an interpreter, and we approached a roadblock to try and get to another part of the city, and I realized after about 30 seconds of conversation that this man who'd hired himself to us was trembling and sweating with fear. And when we got past the roadblock, I asked him why. He said they were the wrong clan. And I thought that they were going to kill me because I was in the wrong clan, because that is what would have happened. But they were so interested in the presence of the foreigners that they didn't notice. The whole place, blasted, devastated. None of the appurtenances of civilization that you would expect. Absolutely nothing. No telephones, no electricity, no water supply, nothing, except behind private compounds where you could shelter from it. And every single person engaged in a war of all against all in which the strongest would triumph. Well, I eventually got out of there, and some weeks after I'd returned, I was shown a book of pictures of Mogadishu as it had been 20 years before. And as many of you will know, it had been an Italian colony until quite recently, and what I saw was the street where I had been. And it was smoothly paved, and smart modern cars were rolling up and down it, and white-gloved traffic policemen were directing the traffic, and there were telephone kiosks and cafes in which people were enjoying cups of coffee and pleasant drinks. Everybody was well-dressed. Nobody was armed. There was absolutely no hint whatsoever that 2 decades from then, it would be as it was. And I was filled, on seeing that picture, with the conviction, which I've had ever since, that the civilization in which we live is extraordinarily vulnerable, that everything that we see about us, that the safe conveyance home which we expect tonight, that the electricity which comes out of the sockets and the water that comes out of the faucet, that the order and peace and security which we take for granted are temporary, rare, and by no means to be relied upon. I put this together with another experience, lasting rather longer. And that was the 2.5 years which I spent living in what was, when I arrived there, Soviet Moscow, and what was, when I left it, the capital of the Russian Federation and no longer a communist state and no longer a communist capital. And there were many, many things about Moscow which were saddening and dispiriting. The language which was spoken was a horribly debased and brutal version of the Russian which had existed 70 years before. The people were miserably dressed. The houses weren't houses. Everybody lived in vast industrial apartment blocks. The institution of marriage had more or less ceased to exist. If you ever saw a family of husband, wife, and 2 children, the children were never full brothers and sisters. They were always half brothers because the family was the fruit of at least 2 divorces. Abortions outnumbered live births. That was the nature of that society, and there were small things in it as well. I remember going into the Moscow metro, which anybody who's attempted a tour of Moscow will have been told is this magnificent, wonderful architectural triumph. Well, indeed it is, because it was created by slave labor in a pharaonic episode of digging in which thousands died, and also because it was decorated by plundering hundreds upon hundreds of destroyed and ravaged churches which had been obliterated by the Soviet regime and had all their decorations and their art and their gold and their silver and their possessions taken out of them and used to glorify the Soviet power. But if you went into one of these stations on a winter's day, there were very, very heavy swing doors designed to keep out the bitter weather. And as a well-brought-up English person, I began my time in Moscow by holding these doors open for the people behind me, politely and considerately. And they looked at me as if I were mad. They also looked at me with a considerable amount of suspicion. They thought I was playing a trick on them. They had never in their entire lives come across a gesture of consideration to another person. All conscience had been nationalized. The whole idea of what was good had become the property of the state. Nobody had any individual responsibility to do anything, whether it was in the job that they did or the family that they didn't actually sustain because it was so besieged by evil state forces undermining the authority and nurture of parents of children. None of these things were theirs. The only time that you could get any kind of politeness and civility and conversation in Russian life was in total privacy, where everybody trusted everybody implicitly because they all knew them and were related to them. Under those circumstances you'd find it, but in the public street it had gone. And again, this seemed to me to be an indication that what we took for granted in my own country and what you take for granted here is not always present, can be undermined, was in that case systematically and deliberately undermined. What happened in the Soviet Union was not an accident. The destruction particularly of religion and of the married family, the idea that human beings were disposable in mass abortion, was part of what the Soviet regime actively wished to promote among its population. And part of what many, many idealists who would now disown the Soviet system and say they had nothing whatever to do with it, still actually see as desirable goals. And then, in the final months of my time in the Soviet Union, I had a very early version of the internet which enabled me to read the wire services, domestic and international, on my computer in my office in Moscow. And I had grown up the son of a naval officer in a very pleasant suburb of the British naval base at Portsmouth, a completely peaceful, safe, civilized part of the country where nothing bad ever happened and where my parents used to let my brother and me roam about without any fear that anything would happen to us during the day, knowing we'd come home safely. One of those places. And it was called Alverstoke. And the name, being unusual, sticks in the mind and leaps out of any page of print. And I was going through the domestic wire service reports from Britain, and I saw that something had happened in Alverstoke. And it was that a man had been in his front garden, what I think you would call a front yard. And we have fences for our front gardens. And a group of youths had been passing and had decided to kick his fence, and I think to swear at him. And he had remonstrated with them, and as a result, he'd been beaten to death. And this had happened in a place which I knew to have been different. I knew for certain, absolutely for certain, that what had happened in this place would not ever have happened in my country at that time. And then I came home. I came home from Moscow and I lived in my own country again, and over again I was reminded in the thought police pronouncements of political correctness, in the leaden way in which bureaucracy operated, in the debasement of the language which people around me, right up to our Prime Minister, spoke, and above all, in the increasing nationalization of conscience and the absence of individual concern for good, that I was living in a country that was remarkably like the Soviet Union, which I'd been so glad to leave, and that many ideas seemed to have got loose in the Western world, which you would have thought were so discredited by Marxist utopianism that they would never ever arise again. And it became my conviction, as it is now, that the fall of the Berlin Wall, far from simply liberating the people of East Germany, and the fall of the Iron Curtain, far from simply liberating the people under the Soviet yoke, also allowed a large number of discredited ideas to spread into our society, ones which, because they were associated during the entire Cold War with an enemy, were discredited universally and confined to very small intellectual pockets, were becoming extraordinarily universal. And one of those ideas which now seems to me to be very prevalent indeed in my country and increasingly prevalent in yours, is the idea that religion is the enemy, that particularly the Christian religion is the enemy of freedom, the enemy of culture, something which can actually be so dangerous that when it's taught to children as truth, it can be regarded as child abuse. And it is as an opponent of that tendency and someone who sees where it comes from and believes he knows where it leads that I was drawn into writing this book, The Rage Against God, because I thought there are plenty of people far more qualified than I to write Christian apologetics. Plenty of people far more qualified than I to defend the theology, to defend the biblical scholarship, to defend the record of the Christian church. That's for them. But here was I, someone who had actually been a Marxist revolutionary, somebody who had actually lived in real existing socialism, somebody who could recognize the ideas and intentions of revolutionaries and who saw them again revived, who could uniquely, it seemed to me, set myself against this trend and say, this is where it comes from, this is where it leads. This rage against God is not just the American Civil Liberties Union trying to get the Ten Commandments removed from some town square. This rage against God is directed against the actual foundations of the free constitutions of all the most advanced countries in the world. Countries which, in my view, are advanced because of the extraordinary combination of ordered liberty which arises and arises only from the Christian religion. There are many, many other arguments for the Christian religion, but this seems to me to be one which we should not neglect. And that these people threaten that, and if they can succeed in their project, which is to drive Christianity out of the Constitution, out of public life, out of the education of children, out of the culture, out of the literature, out of everything, and turn us into secularists, then they will have begun the process which might lead us all to Mogadishu. And I can tell you that that is somewhere where you do not want to go. And I will leave it at that and take any questions anyone likes to throw at me.
I'm sorry, you'll have to wend your way to that microphone, but we want to encourage you to do that. At Socrates in the City, we always ask you, please phrase your question in the form of a question. Very important, if you don't mind. I'm a legalist in asking that, I know. But please keep your questions short and make them actual questions, and we can begin now. Thank you. And thank you, Peter. Delightful.
Mr. Hitchens, thank you so much for being here. I've read your book just one time through. I want to tell you how very clear it is, how very succinct, and how very helpful it's been. And I congratulate you for the strength that I could feel just in reading your words. And I wanted to comment on page 159. You talk about leaders who abuse piety for non-Christian ends, and I congratulate you for being brave enough, courageous enough to put that in writing. But I would ask, based on your talk this evening and knowing that that is not a good thing to do, what are your suggestions of how we can move forward and to keep our Christian faith in our society?
Well, I think one of the things we should do is we should get our political leaders to stop attacking it. And I think what is central to this in any policy, and this is a simple matter of domestic policy which the countries of the Anglosphere need urgently to address, is the attack on that thing which is, as far as I'm concerned, the pillar which holds up the sky, which is the institution of marriage. Now, in my country and in yours, in the 1960s, laws were passed which meant the following: that even if two people had contracted publicly to form a lifelong union, that if one of them decided that they wished to cease that union, and one of them decided they wanted to continue it, the state could burst into the home of those two people and drag out the person who wanted to continue the marriage with force and the threat of imprisonment and bring it to an end. That's not how they put it. They said, we want to save women from the tyranny of being stuck with an abusive husband. They said, people get tired of being married. But that's what it actually means. And this enormous irruption of the state into people's lives has done incalculable damage to millions and millions and millions of children. It has done incalculable damage to private life, which can only flourish where there are strong families and households. And that alone would seem to me to be the fundamental duty of any person who comes into government and considers himself to be a Christian, to at least make it harder to end a marriage than it is to get out of a car leasing agreement. And I cannot say strongly enough how important this is. And when you contrast this, obviously rather difficult cultural battle, with the things which politicians actually do. Now they say it's too difficult to confront the culture and to say we made a mistake in the 1960s about this and a number of other things, so we won't do that. But they don't count it too difficult to make war upon foreign countries in such a way, as and this is the case in all wars, that innocent people in large numbers are blown to pieces. Why is it they're so uninhibited about doing that and so inhibited about tackling the things which really need to be tackled? I'll tell you why. Because the one is easy and the other is difficult. But actually, one asks not for the state to intervene on the side of the Christian religion, but to stop intervening against it. I give lots of other examples, but that seems to me to be the central one. And I have to say, I've seen war zones. I've seen what someone looks like after they've been shot in the head. And I'm not a pacifist, and I never will be. I was brought up, as I say, as a son of an officer of the British Royal Navy. I couldn't really be a pacifist if I tried. But I do very, very much believe that war is something which should not be easily resorted to. And it certainly should not be something which begins with the playing of rock music on an aircraft carrier and an admiral shouting, "It's hammer time," as a missile is launched, which will almost certainly kill innocent people when it arrives. And I do not think that it should be a television entertainment, a firework display for people to sit on their couches and watch either. It's a serious business. And I think there's been an unserious approach to war among our politicians for some time.
Allowed me to make a confession. I lived 20 years under communism, so I can understand your position on that. And if you allowed me to, in a humble way, to tell you what I come to a conclusion is that Marxist socialism, it wants to be actually a religion. And you cannot serve two masters. So therefore, the question that you ask yourself about the idea of religion as we know it, Christianity, cannot exist in a communist country, I think that's one of the reasons. And now that I'm trying to make short the introduction, I know Mr. Metax, I understand. I know.
He's coming to get you.
Okay, and I'm coming with the question, actually. I know. And I, on the other hand, I'm sorry, I've never been a Trotskyist. It looks like the best neocon and so on came out from that background, but you understand, I never had a chance. The question
it's too late now.
I know, and I accept gracefully. Anyhow, the question I'm asking you is, as a Christian, I'd like to know how to react, and I even had a big fight with a friend of mine, a devoted Christian, about this idea of a 9/11 mosque. What I'm trying to say is, do you accept, if we accept it as a form of appeasement, it's turning the other cheek, or should we be Jesus in the market that turns the tables? I'm confused, so I need your help.
I'm a little confused as well, but I will try even so to answer what I think it is that you want to know. As for the 9/11 mosque, it brings to mind the way in which a certain president of the United States was given to saying that the Islamists, terrorists and murderers had attacked this country and the West in general because they hate our way of life. And I thought, hang on, I hate our way of life. And it doesn't impel me to make terrorist attacks on the United States. I need to say this about something else because I'll never get a visa if they think that it does, but I do hate our way of life. I think that it is profoundly selfish, materialistic, hubristic, and godless in many, many frightening ways. I don't think that the practice of Islam is itself the enemy. I'm a Christian. I think Islam is an inferior religion to Christianity. But I think, on the other hand, that as a religion it contains many, many elements which are praiseworthy. And anybody who travels as I do, for instance, I was recently in Gaza and on the west bank of the River Jordan, and talking to Arabs and experiencing, as some of you will have done, the extraordinarily, almost unthinking hospitality which makes our cities and our civilization look so cold by comparison. And these people were mostly Muslims, though not all of them. But it is, I don't think that if we wish to challenge Islam in the world, that we challenge it either with our wealth or with our military power. That we can only challenge it by showing that our society is in fact superior and that Christian society is superior. And we can only do that by making our societies more Christian. Banning mosques, burning Qurans and I think rubbish of that kind, in my view, will certainly not achieve anything of the kind. If we want to prove that we are superior to Islam and that what we say is actually better in effect and indeed in nature, then we can only prove it by living more Christian lives and having more Christian societies.
So we should be the better men. So we should be the better men. I'm sorry, ladies. We should be the better people then.
Yes.
Okay.
Hi. Who are the people who are undermining our traditions and our way of life, and where did they come from, and how did they gain this voice that seems to be dominant?
It is a fascinating question and one which I haven't been fully able to answer. What I do know is that a lot of it originates in the 1960s, and much of it is in the academy and on the college campuses in the 1960s.
Our generation.
I'm sorry?
Our generation.
Well, mine anyway. But it is. I wouldn't like to speak for anybody else, but it comes in many cases in a form in which people don't actually understand that it has origins. Maynard Keynes used to say that every politician was, usually without knowing it, the slave of some defunct economist, which I think we know to be true. And it is also the case that almost every campus ideologue is the slave of some obscure Marxist philosopher, whether it be Herbert Marcuse or Wilhelm Reich, or indeed the Frankfurt School people who I think William Lind is convinced are the originators of political correctness, or of an Italian Marxist who realized very early on that the Soviet Union was doomed and that if communism wished to take over the world, this was the wrong way, called Antonio Gramsci. And there were people, when I was at college in the 1970s, the early 1970s, who knew this. And there were also many people who listened to them who didn't know it and who absorbed, in that way that people do, these ideas without knowing where they come from. But they are fundamentally Marxist, and they are fundamentally utopian. And they contain a belief that the world can be begun over again. And they necessarily aim at what Gramsci called cultural hegemony. That is to say, you take over, the old revolutionaries, they would take over the post office and the railroad station and the police station and the main square. These people, they take over the school classroom and the TV studio and the newspaper office and all those places where you get your ideas from that you think are your own. And it's quite rare, I mean, don't want to be rude to anybody, but it's quite rare when arguing with someone in the modern world, particularly someone who's in the grip of Six's ideas, for them to concede the simple fact that most of the ideas which they speak of and which they claim to have are no more their ideas than the clothes which they wear were woven by themselves. They've simply adopted the fashions of the time, as people do. And these things are immensely powerful. And so when you have an entire society in which every person who considers himself educated, with very few exceptions, has been colonized by these revolutionary ideas, then you have an awful lot of utopianism about. And there is no counter to it, because so many of the conservative institutions of the country have been the ones which have been most effectively taken over. And the churches themselves, full of secular liberalism, the academy, which ought to defend such things as the canon of literature and the proper teaching of history and decent philosophy, are full of deconstructionists and people who want to teach rap music instead of Bach. And these, as far as I'm concerned, these traitors to culture and conservative morality are everywhere in places where they ought not to be. So origins, I think, roughly there, but the transmission belt by which this rubbish has become the accepted wisdom of the educated is the college culture. And by the way, Woodrow Wilson was the man who said, I think in 1914, that it was his intention as a college president to make sure that every man who came under his care ended up disagreeing with his own father. And that certainly seems to be the intention of most college campuses now.
Thank you.
That's never happened in 10 years.
Oh my God. The microphone just attacked these people. It was terrible. Just trying to get it right. Hi. I went to 3 different bookstores, well, 2 bookstores and a library today to try to get your book so I could read up about you before I came. And they didn't have it, but the Stamford, Connecticut bookstore, Barnes & Noble has it, in case it's not around here or out at the table. But what I did, so I went online and said, what's this guy about? I know what his brother's about. And so I read a bunch of your articles in the Daily Mail, I think it is. And I came across this incredible one that blew my mind, so I wanted to ask you about it. It was, I think, September 10th, and you basically said, what we need is a new revolutionary manifesto for conservative Christians to address the sick spirit of our age. And that would be Thomas Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer, copyright 1662. So I thought, well, this is, well, you know, I'm a good Episcopalian. I've read my prayer book. I mean, so how different could it be? So I went and read it thing. And so the good news was I got out of it what I think seems to be a lot of what you really value in your religious tradition, which is the fabulous aesthetics, the poetry of the book, in which you've pointed out could be the very thing, not reason, that could trigger an atheist to perhaps experiencing faith or beginning to believe or hope that there's a God. But I accidentally read the rest of it, and I came across this great section called the Articles of Religion. And so, and as opposed to all the poetry and the cathedrals and Jerusalem playing in the background, there's a list of, these are all the things we believe in. So guys, focus on it. And it's not lyrical, it's legalistic. And I thought, well, this is nice. And there's the affirmation of the creeds. So a lot of my fellow mainstream Protestant denomination people have the trouble with the virginity of Mary or the bodily resurrection being anything other than metaphorical and all that stuff. I said, oh, that's fine. But then there's a whole section just slagging on the Baptists, calling their view of baptism as detestable heresies. There's a whole section just doing a beatdown on the Catholics for having a different view of transubstantiation versus consubstantiation. Then it gets into the really unpleasant stuff of saying, if you perform charitable works just out of goodwill or community civic pride, that's sinful because you're not doing it for the grace of God. Then it says, by the way, if you weren't bummed out enough already, okay, well, just the 2 things. Why I wonder, why is this good for our age? One of the things it basically says, any man that says a man can achieve salvation through following his own religion, a Jew, a Muslim, a Buddhist, needs to be cursed. That is such an offensive idea. By the way, there's only a few, even among Christians, that are among the elect. The rest are damned. So I was just wondering, were you serious?
You get the award for the most long long-winded question.
No,
Thank you.
look, hey,
I accept your judgment.
Good question.
you
but
can have it.
let's try to keep them briefer. Let's try to keep them briefer.
Yeah.
In fact, infinitely briefer.
I think there is a sort of way in which the letter killeth and the spirit giveth life here. You've looked at the book, and you've ignored everything in it that's important, and you've gone to the small print at the back and said, "Oh, this is the core of it." I'm not going to go into a history of the religious arguments of 16th century England now, unless anybody would really like one. Every time I go to work and every time I come home in the evening, I bicycle past the spot where Thomas Cranmer was burned alive for his beliefs. And that's how they did it in those days. And the passion of that time, I think probably most of us would not wish to return. But if you want to talk about the 39 Articles some other time, I'll do it. The point about the book and the things that you should have read were the collects and the fundamental prayers that we are supposed to say, and the catechism. But you should just have noticed the main thing about it, which is, as I say, the immense poetic power. Now, music is the language in which God speaks to man in many ways, because it says things which are inexpressible in language. And poetry is one step down from that. But take, for instance, the collect for the fourth Sunday after Easter. O God, from whom all holy desires... No, hang on a minute, I've got to get this absolutely right now. And I'm standing up here, not expecting this question. Give me a second. O Almighty God, who alone canst order the unruly wills and affections of sinful men, grant unto thy people that they may love the thing which thou commandest, and desire that which thou dost promise, that so, among the sundry and manifold changes of this world, our hearts may surely there be fixed, where true joys are to be found. Try saying that to yourself night and morning, and see if it has any effect on you. It's the important bit, and I say you've just gone. I think it is the inevitable fate of the defender of the Christian religion to be confronted with this kind of sort of legalistic nitpicking, and I'm inured to it. But you know as well as I do that it's not the point.
You know the Church of England has tried to get rid of the Articles for 100 years, and Parliament wouldn't let them.
Hey, look,
it's just
some other time. I really think you're just trying to get away from the point.
Give the man a chance to talk, please. Just because we want to get to everybody, that's why it is important to keep the questions brief. So.
Peter, you actually answered my question about part of it about Islam, because I was going to address the issue of Islam. But I want you to take it a step further. How do you, as a journalist, and me as a journalist, address the issue of Islam practically? When you see journalists, like I would call them journalists, like Larry King, interviewing someone like Kathy Griffin, who's saying that the cause of the Clementi young man who jumped off the bridge in George Washington Bridge because everybody knows the story, is because of Christianity. Christianity drives them insane. How would you answer, as a journalist, the stories about Proposition 8, when they focus on Christianity as the problem? Also, the issue, for instance, Palladino, who got blasted for being anti-gay, but never addressed the issue of the Orthodox Church being that way or Islam being that way. In terms of the whipping boy, why do you think Christianity is singled out and Islam is given a pass on some of these same topics?
Well, there's a simple answer, which is that people are scared of Islam. And they're afraid that if they attack it, then it will hit back. And we know that this is true, and people are not scared of Christianity or the Christian church. They don't expect any fatwas or any nasty late-night visits as a result of saying anything rude about Islam. So, yeah, but I think the argument about homosexuality is one which I now straightforwardly refuse to have in England, because it is a diversion. The issue of sexual morality in Christianity is quite a simple one. That is to say that as far as Christianity is concerned, there is only one moral sexual relationship, and that is lifelong marriage. Now, of the many, many activities which do not conform to that, homosexuality is a small and, in my view, insignificant one. And it is used incessantly by propagandists against religion because, under the current form of argument, the worst thing you can possibly do to anybody is discriminate against them. And if you can maintain that homosexual persons are a minority against whom Christians wish to discriminate, even if it isn't true, then you've won the argument and nobody will listen to anything else you say. And so I simply turn it back. I will not argue about it anymore. It is so. We enacted in my country a few years ago legislation to allow civil partnerships for homosexuals, male or female, almost equivalent to marriage. I personally am opposed to this, but that's not the point that I'm seeking to make here. After this was enacted, a very small number of people took advantage of it. And some of them have already got divorced. And it seemed to me that the whole fiction, which began with the ridiculous and frankly ludicrous research, not even research, of Alfred Kinsey, suggesting there was an enormous number of homosexuals in society, and the constant, incessant propaganda on this subject from people whose real interest is actually to attack the basic idea that sexual morality should be contained in marriage and people should contain themselves, has been a diversion. And the more that Christians attempt to fight it, the more they will fail. You simply say, that is not the point. That is not what we are arguing about. And it is not, I'm not saying it's a magic bullet, but I am saying that it does end you from walking into what is invariably a trap. The person who raises that issue isn't going to listen to anything else you say anyway, and will misrepresent what the Christian church says about homosexuality anyway. And you will not win. But the people who are listening outside, particularly if you're broadcasting, will be interested to hear that the argument is really about something else.
I haven't read your book yet, but I gather that your brother has not had the same revelation that you have had, and I was wondering if you could just give us a little bit more color on what it's like at family reunions and dinners and that sort of thing.
Well, I have to urge you to buy the book because it describes one such family reunion. I think I better leave it at that, since you're all so interested.
I'm not going to ask you about your brother.
You can if you like. It's all right. I'm not sensitive.
I'm not very good at these. I'm half English, and it's always struck me that having an established church in England has sucked the life out of Christianity there, because when the church is associated with power, people get attracted to the church for the wrong reasons, and power and the gospel are sort of antithetical. And I was wondering if you agreed, and if so, if you thought that that was going to change in England, or if there was anything that churches with a small c could do or are doing on that front.
No, I don't agree. I think it's a thing which people often say, but it doesn't stand up to a moment's examination. The Church of England is established by law, but the church in Wales, the Anglican Church in Wales, is not established. There is no established church in Wales, and nor is there in Scotland. But the decline of Christianity in the British Isles has been exactly as bad in the places where the church is disestablished as where it is established. And if you go to Welsh mining towns, you will see streets, and in almost every one of them, a magnificent, nonconformist, unestablished chapel, empty, derelict. Nobody goes there anymore. It's not to do with establishment. If you want to know why I think religion collapsed, Christian religion collapsed in my country, we've got a pretty good Islamic establishment in Britain now, growing at an amazing rate. But when the Christian religion collapsed in Britain as a whole, it was after the 1914-18 war, when the Christian churches supported that war when they should have opposed it with every breath in their body.
Thank you.
At the beginning of the speech, you argued quite eloquently against government and secular leaders from intervening and passing laws that allow things like the sanctity of marriage to be so easily dissolved. And I admire that because it's quite a libertarian opinion. But in the next breath, you turned around and suggest that Christians inflict their beliefs and doctrine upon others to prevent this very type of precipitous dissolution from occurring. Why does that not make Christianity hypocritical? And the second part of my question is, Jesus did not inflict his doctrine on anyone, so why do we?
As somebody who's done quite a lot of biased journalism in my life, I know that the crucial words are the verbs. If I said I would like to forcibly preach my religion to you, then you'd know, wouldn't you, that it was a biased statement. But if I use the verb inflict, then it passes by and people don't realize until too late. Just as when you've got a politician who said something and you want to describe that he said it, but you want to imply that you don't believe him, you say he claimed it. Or if you think that he's resisting pressure to tell the truth, you say he insisted on the thing that he said that you don't believe. Well, you said inflict. What's this infliction? Am I proposing the sending of armed persons round to people's houses to tell them that they must become Christians? Am I going to send people round to their houses and say, if you don't become a Christian, your child won't get into college? Am I going to use the sort of methods which communist societies used to punish and threaten people into open conformism and open support of the regime and the ideology which they didn't want to do? I've never said that, or anything like it. Well, so perhaps you better tell me, what's this infliction? And as for hypocrisy, of course I'm a hypocrite. Yeah, everybody in this room is one, but that we take that as given. But it's a question of whether in the course of my hypocrisy I might be doing something good that concerns me.
Is good not a subjective opinion? Good can never really be objective. Look, let me just qualify something. I want
to know what this infliction is, how I'm going to force it on anybody.
Well, I think one of the strongest arguments levelled against Christians is this argument of hypocrisy. Why do you have the right to tell me how to live my life, but I don't have the right to tell you how to live yours?
I don't. I have no rights at all in the matter.
Right. So why then do we so easily say that our politicians should, wouldn't it be nice if we had politicians that would implement such doctrine and policy that would prevent simple dissolution of marriage, or things that would, in other words, contradict Christian doctrine?
Tell you what are the origins of the society in which we now live and move and have our being? Why is it like this? Why is this a society in which people are free to speak their minds and not be punished for it? Why am I allowed to write what I like? Why do we have the rule of law? Why is it that in this country and in mine, if the government does something illegal and a court says it's illegal, the government has to stop doing it? Why is it that here you do not have the rule of power? Why do you have scientific inquiry? Why do we have literature? Why do we have music? We have these things because these societies were founded upon Christianity. It is the founding charter of the society in which we live. If you propose to remove that founding charter, you'll have a different kind of society. And if you want to do that, argue it straight. Say, I don't like all this liberty. I don't like this pluralism. I don't like the rule of law. I don't like literature. I don't like music. I want a lot of censorship. I want people who are rich and powerful to always to be in charge and for there to be no restraint on them. I want there to be no absolute morality on which the rule of law has to be based, because if there isn't absolute morality, there is no basis for the rule of law, for where else does it come from? If you want all those things, then say so. But that's the society we have, and we live in it, and we enjoy it, and most of the aspects of it which I've listed, I reckon if I asked you, you'd be in favour of them. But if I then say to you, all you need to do is to stop attacking the Christian basis of the society to preserve those things, then you'd start telling me I'm inflicting my religion on you. Well, I don't think that's actually a correct or indeed honest interpretation of events.
Okay.
Could you please elaborate on Christianity's effect on the U.S. Constitution? Thank you.
How can I begin? Take a trip to the National Archives and you'll find that among the other founding documents of the United States is the English Magna Carta. And the English Magna Carta was the first instance of power being subjected to law. And on that is based the entire constitutional law of the United States, and indeed of my own country. That's where it begins. And one could, there are arguments, for instance, that the idea of the Holy Trinity is one of the bases of pluralism. But fundamentally, what Christianity does is that it says that society should be ruled above all else by conscience. And conscience is meaningless, it seems to me, without a religious belief, because if conscience has no connection with an absolute morality issuing from an almighty creator, then it could just as well be your bile duct telling you what to do. I pay very little attention to my bile duct. And how about you? So I could go on for hours about why it is so, and I think, but look at the founding of the country. Look at who founded it and why. They came, for the most part, from my country because they wanted to be free to practice their Christianity in the way that they wanted to. That's what they were. They founded it on that basis. That's what it is. And it could have no other origin. And look at the other civilizations. And look particularly at China. 3,000 years of recorded history. And almost no scientific development. And a society which to this day is completely shameless about being a police state. It's not just that it is a police state. It's that it has no qualms at any part of its policy or culture about being one. So when a Chinese dissident is given a Nobel Prize, the response to the Chinese leadership is to shrug and to ignore it and to suppress the news. Whereas if any society which had any vestige of Christianity or Christian culture in it had been confronted with this, it would have been shamed. China is not shamed. And I think just to look on that, everybody, if they can, should go to modern China and see this terrifying thing. The first time in modern history, probably in all history, of a state in which freedom and prosperity have been separated. I lived all my life in the certainty that you could not be prosperous unless you were free. China proves the contrary. You can be prosperous and unfree, and it's there, and it is a rival civilization. And if you want to see how things could have been otherwise, if there had been no Christianity, it's a good place to go and look.
Mr. Hitchens, I promise you that my question will be short, and I'm prepared that your answer might be also. But in your tour of duty in Moscow, which obviously was a very important part of your life, how would you compare the Moscow of today with the time when you were there originally? And in other words, on a scale of 1 to 10, if Portsmouth is 10 and Moscow when you were there originally is 1 or 0, where are they now?
Well, I think the simplest way of summing up the transformation is that it's gone from Sparta to Babylon. And the one was disgusting and the other is disgusting. And part of the point that I make in the book, again, you have to read it, but part of the point, if you can find it. It's a funny thing about conservative books, isn't it? They're always still in the storeroom. We authors, we know this. Anyway, one of the things I say in the book is that, of course, if you vacuum all Christianity out of society, if you systematically suppress it, and not just Christianity but other religions too, there were Jewish members of the Soviet elite and their children at some point in the 1980s decided they'd have a big party to celebrate Yom Kippur. That was how little people knew about their own religions. It had all gone. The connection had gone. It had been vacuumed out of people's lives, out of the culture, out of their souls. And when the Soviet state, which was a very strong state, collapsed, then there was nothing except another form of authoritarianism to restrain it, and it was a form of authoritarianism which, of course, permitted the debauchery, the prostitution and the gambling dens and the grotesque billionaires that you now find there. So what is there now is not the antithesis of what was there before, but actually the result of it.
not going to be able to get to everyone's questions, so we always, to respect everybody, end sharply at 8:25. So I apologize to those of you at the back of the line. I don't think you'll get your chance.
I'll give shorter answers.
Thank you for your time this evening. T.S. Eliot wrote 2 essays, The Idea of a Christian Society and Notes Toward a Definition of Culture, in which he argues that liberal society, modern society as we know it, is fundamentally based on kind of negative content, rights as antagonistic, me against you, that sort of thing. And he argues from this kind of starting point that modern liberal society will go one of 2 directions. It will become either Christianized or a pagan society. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that thesis, and also if you could comment on the compatibility of Christianity and liberal democracy.
Sorry, the compatibility of Christianity with what?
With liberal democracy, I'm sorry.
I think it's entirely compatible with liberal democracy, provided that it isn't dethroned as the founding charter of society. I think that there is a danger that it will create within itself the demands for self-indulgence which lead to where we are now. I think it would pay modern Britain quite a compliment to call it a pagan society. I'll leave it at that. I'm trying to be brief.
Thank you.
We eventually got our hands on a copy of your book in Australia after stumbling over mountains of your brother's books. When I moved from atheism to be a Christian some time ago, the place of reason and logic and history was really important in that. I know there's more than that. And I was struck by the statement in your book, I'm going to accidentally misquote it, something about how you thought that poetry might be more helpful in your brother perhaps moving away from his present position than reason. I think you said something like that. I'm happy to be corrected. But
well, I'll tell you exactly what I said. Yeah. I said that he'd bricked himself up so high in his atheist tower that he had arrow slits rather than windows out of which to hurl fiery darts at the faithful. And I said that it was far more likely that he or any other atheist would be ambushed in the heart by poetry than they would be brought around by reason. And I think that is so. And I think that's one of the points of poetry and why religion and poetry and religion and music and religion and architecture should never be separated, and why when the two come together the result is almost always beautiful.
Can I just ask that?
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Hitchens. I want to thank you, first of all, for coming out and sharing with us. My question for you is, in my approach in dealing with atheists and skeptic friends, I found that it's come to the point where it's futile to argue with them because they know what they believe, they know the arguments very well. So I come with more of just sharing my own testimony. And I'm just wondering, I know you're a very intellectual guy, but have you experienced God supernaturally, like maybe in your travels in dangerous places, maybe with a divine intervention or an angel, guardian angel story or anything like that you could share?
I'd love it if I could say yes, but I can't, no. My path to this is entirely one of reason. Okay. And my point that I think is invariably the case with the people whom you describe, the flying spaghetti monster guys, and who think they're really, really clever. Have you noticed? And who also get so angry and enraged at Christian believers. The point about belief, the fundamental point about belief, is you have to want to believe, and it's a choice. No one's going to help you by giving you a vision or having an angel visit at 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon saying, hey, it's true. It's not going to happen. You have to decide. And the thing that seems to me to be quite simple about this is do you want to live in an ordered and purposeful universe in which there is justice and in which your actions can affect the outcome of events? Or do you want to live in a meaningless chaos? I can't see why anyone would want the second. But there is a very interesting most atheists are totally intolerant of Christian believers and are fantastically rude to them. And here I am defending the religion and turning the other cheek. I can't be as rude back as I'd like to be as a result. But It is interesting. There is one American philosopher, Thomas Nagel, who is an atheist, and he says, I really do wonder why sometimes I want there not to be a God so much. And I wonder it too. Why don't they want there to be a God so much? What is it they don't want? But that's what you have to ask them. But no experiences, I'm afraid, of that kind. I wish I could, but I can't.
Yes, so thank you again for taking the time. So it seems to me that Christianity is under attack in the United States, especially in ways that never been true in the history of this country, between skepticism and Eastern mysticism, Islam, strident atheism. And I'm just wondering your thoughts. Will this ultimately result in making Christianity in this country a more robust, orthodox Christianity than would have been the case without these attacks? If we look historically, Christianity has responded, and I think people who have argued with your brother, Christian philosophers who have argued with your brother, I'm just like you to just opine on will these attacks ultimately make Christianity stronger in this country? Thank you.
There's a great hope that it may be so, because I think an awful lot of Christians who had taken their intellectual supremacy of the faith for granted have discovered that that isn't the case, and have had to make the effort to argue. Also because I think that arguing is the most educational thing in the world, far more educational than any school I ever went to. And serious debate has sharpened the argument and shown many people, first of all, that there is a powerful intellectual and scientific and moral case for the Christian faith, which they maybe hadn't been aware of before. And there is a terrible tendency in the modern world to associate it with unreason and anti-scientism and knuckles brushing the ground. This has been demonstrated, it seems to me, in these debates of the past few years to be absolutely untrue, and that can only strengthen it. But the battle is by no means over, and the enemy still is walking across the fields to meet us.